About our speaker tonight, we have Jessica Wilkins. She's a classical musician turned a software engineer and a technical writer. She loves working with various web technologies. She has a background in music and once owned a own sheet music company called JDW Sheet Music and shared her expertise by performing and teaching in Los Angeles. CA. Oh, wow, that's nice. Now she works full-time as a software developer at FreeCode Camp. Awesome. Helping to build out the new JavaScript and front-end libraries curriculums to be used by millions of individuals. A prolific writing extends to more than 100 articles published in renowned platforms like FreeCode Camp, Gatsby Blog, and Devto, highlighting her expertise and enthusiasm for the tech industry. Let's welcome Jessica. Welcome, Jessica.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
having me.
Yeah.
It's great to be here. And so I will go ahead and share my screen. I put together a little PowerPoint, and then we can have some questions afterwards and a little chat afterwards. But yeah, and so I decided I actually will also talk about my own journey into tech writing, and especially since I am a career changer. But let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, cool. And let's go ahead and hide these tools right here. Let's see, hide. There we go. Okay, cool. So can everybody see my screen? Yes. Okay, cool. So I'll start the slideshow. All right. So yes, we are going to talk all about tech blogging. I think it's super cool that you guys are going to have this challenge to get started with tech writing. So some of you might already have written technical articles in the past, or maybe it's been a few years, or maybe this is your first time. So we're going to cover all of that and like how to approach that within this presentation there. So yeah, so we kind of already talked a little bit about me, but I'll tell more of like the story of how I got here. So in 2020, actually before 2020, I spent 8+ years as a classical musician in Los Angeles, California, doing recording sessions for like Netflix and stuff like that, and award shows and whatnot. So I kind of lived that lifestyle for a while, and then the pandemic happened, and obviously everything shut down. And so around June of 2020, I had an idea for a project to build, which was called the Black Excellence Music Project. And the reason why I wanted to build that project was because there was a lot of race relations and tensions within the air because of George Floyd's murder. And it sparked a conversation about the lack of diversity in a lot of industries, including mine, within the classical world, specifically within the music industry. So I decided to create this website to highlight the accomplishments of Black composers within the classical and like romantic fields in early 20th century, as well as like modern composers that identify as African American there. So that kind of sparked my coding journey. And from there, I fell in love with just writing. And I was actually super, super involved within FreeCodeCamp just as a participant on the forum because I decided to learn how to code to build out this website. So I started learning with FreeCodeCamp. I fell in love with the community. So I just started answering all these questions, even though I was like a complete beginner. And that sparked the interest of a few people. So that's how I got like my first contract job as a junior dev. And then also that's how I met Quincy. He reached out to me. He was like, hey, you're crazy involved in our forum. Do you want to be a moderator? And I was like, sure. And then he's like, do you want to write articles for us? We could pay you. And I was like, that sounds even better. So that's kind of how the ball got rolling. And at the time, I was a little bit nervous about writing because I was like only a few months in at this point. I think I was like 4 or 5 months into learning. So I didn't think I had anything to write about. But he had reassured me. He's like, actually, you'd be the perfect person to write beginner friendly articles because you have that fresh perspective that a lot of more experienced developers might not have. And so I started just writing articles slowly but surely and then developed my confidence from there and worked with the editorial staff. And then they brought me on part-time and started bringing writing technical articles. And then I got my first job at a JavaScript consultancy and worked there for about a year and a half or so. And then I came back to FreeCodeCamp to work full-time on the JavaScript curriculum and now the front-end libraries curriculum to teach React and TypeScript and all of that fun stuff. So that's basically my journey on like how I got here from like June of 2020 to now, basically. And yeah, and so as mentioned before, during that time, I've written a lot, over 100 technical articles on various subjects in web programming and just career advice. And we'll talk more about like the actual like writing process and how to get started and where to write. But yeah, that's a little bit about me. And cool. So why is technical writing important? Like, why should we even bother to care about this at all? So I think there's a lot of good reasons why you should start technical writing, with technical writing, and some of it is more career based, but then some of it's more like learning based, and we'll talk more about like the different reasons why. But I think there's a lot of benefits to writing, and it helps you practice your communication skills. It helps you showcase your knowledge and skills. And so we'll go into that first reason of how to actually showcase your skills. And so it's no secret that we're not in the best of job markets right now. Before this, like the job market was super, super awesome. And now we're kind of slowly bouncing back ish. I mean, it doesn't help that there have been a recent wave of layoffs that have happened. But we're slowly starting to get back to a healthier state. It's just going to take a while. But one of the ways that you can stand out in the market if you're looking for a job, or you're looking to level up and get a better job, is to showcase your skills, and you can do that through technical writing. So I wrote a few things about what you could showcase. So let's say that you're learning a new concept. So maybe you're in the early days of learning and you're learning about, JavaScript or Python or backend technologies. And the best way to know if you really understand a concept is to write about it, like teach it to somebody else. And so I personally believe in the method of like you learn something, you build something with it, and then you go teach it to somebody else. And so once you've kind of played around with the different technologies you've been learning, the different concepts you've been learning, then you can actually write about it. And this article, it doesn't need to be like thousands and thousands of words. It could be a 500-word article on a concept that you learned about or a new technology you learned about. And you can, sometimes it could be a tutorial, sometimes it could just be a reflection on something that happened within the career, but something that you had just learned you want to write about. I think that's really important there. Some of you might be actively working on personal projects. Maybe you have a really cool project that you just built. Maybe it's for your portfolio site. Maybe it's just for yourself. Maybe there's a problem that you were looking to solve and you want to share that solution with the world. Then you can write about it. And so that way people can take a look at the code that you're writing, how you approach problem solving. And you can say, hey, I had this tricky problem at work, or I had this tricky problem that I was running into, or my friends and I were talking about this and we built this cool project. And here are some of the things that we ran into. And you kind of tell that narrative throughout the article. And so people can see not only your coding prowess, but then they can also, see how you problem solve. So that's another way you can showcase your skills. Another one is if you're contributing to open source. And so I don't know how many of you are open and involved with like open source projects. Some of you might be very involved with open source projects. Some of you might have never contributed before, but maybe you worked on a really cool feature or really tough bug within an open source project. You could write about it and just tell that story and be like, oh, I found this bug on this application, decided to go out and work on it, and here's what I found. And so telling that story is a great way to communicate and show your skills as a problem solver, show the way that you can work with other people within this industry. And then we talked a little bit about this, but like solving hard problems. So let's say you are on the job, you had some crazy hard problem on a client project you're working on, and you finally came to a solution. You can write about it. So there's so many other points to showcase your skills, but I felt like those were kind of like the main ways to showcase your skills and help you stand out in the market right there. So reason number 2 is growing your network. So a lot of people will talk about networking, usually in the context of like getting a job. But I think networking, I view it as like that should be something done 365 all year round, regardless of job status. Just because when you build out your network, you can learn from other people, you can grow with other people, you can share value, they can share value with you. Everybody wins in the end. And so you can meet other people through your writing. People could read your articles and go, hey, I was stuck with this issue on Git or something like that. And they can read that article and go, hey, that was so great. I didn't think about this solution, or that was a really creative solution. And then next thing you know, you guys might start collaborating on a project. You just never know where those connections will lead, who's going to reach out to you, who's going to read your articles. And so this is a great way for you to build out your network, especially if you're newer to the industry and you're looking to get that first job. And then also hiring managers and recruiters. They actually do read your articles. And some might not do it, but some might actually do that. And so if you are active on LinkedIn and you've written some articles and you get in the habit of sharing that, other recruiters and hiring managers can actually see that. And that's happened in my own experiences where I've had recruiters and hiring managers reach out to me because of some of the articles I've written, because they had positions open and they're looking for people, qualified candidates that match those requirements. And so if I'm writing about it and talking about it with confidence, they're going to go, oh, this person seems like they would be a good fit. Let's talk with them. So that's another way that you can stand out within this competitive market and kind of get a little bit of an edge there. So let's go on to reason number 3, expanding your overall skills and knowledge. And so obviously this is an industry where you're constantly learning, whether you're in cybersecurity or you're front end, back end, DevOps, wherever what part of tech you're in, you always are going to have to be learning because technology is obviously continuing to evolve. And so as you're learning new concepts, then you can write about those new concepts. Or if you had a misconception about a concept, I've done that before too, where it's like, oh, I totally thought it was supposed to be this way. Let me write an article about how, I learned through the hard way that it was, it's supposed to work like this, or this is the correct way to use this, technology's API or whatever you're writing about right there. And so you could just always be sharing, no matter where you're at within your tech journey, whether you're a junior, mid, senior, CTO, there's always something to learn. There's always something to share with other people. So those are just a few reasons right there. And there's plenty more, but those are some of the basic reasons on why we should care about technical writing. So how do we actually get started? So we talked about why we should care, but how, the practical of it all. So the first question that a lot of people will ask is, what on God's green earth am I supposed to write about? And we talked a little bit about this, but just write about what you're currently going through. So whether let's say you're like a week into learning how to code, you just started learning about HTML, and you started learning a little bit about CSS, start writing about that. And some people will say, oh, there's plenty of articles about HTML and CSS, but there's only going to be one article with your take on a particular topic in HTML and CSS. And so, yes, even though there are a lot of articles on different HTML elements and CSS selectors, your particular take is going to be unique. And so it still obviously needs to be factual, right? You can't rewrite the rules of CSS, but your particular take and what you want to highlight about certain features of these technologies and how you approach that article will be unique. And someone will read your article and say, wow, I really understood that. It really benefited me in XYZ project or XYZ situation. So just write about what you're currently going through. So some of you might be on the job and you have experiences. You could write about some challenging problems that you faced on the job, or even just career advice, like how you went from junior to mid, or mid to senior, or maybe you just landed your dream role at a large tech company or something like that, or how you learned how to negotiate and stuff like that, or how you dealt with technical interviews. So there's so many areas that you could actually write about and just pull from your personal experiences, what is currently going on in your life that you want to write about, good or bad, right? And so some of you might have gone through setbacks. Some of you might have gone through layoffs. I know what that's like. Layoffs suck. And so even though I was fortunate to land back on my feet, I know a lot of people, they go through months and months and months without a job before they get that next one. I had a lot of friends go through that recently, where they were unemployed for 6 or 8 months. But that's something that you could write about, even though that's not quote unquote as technical. It still kind of falls under that umbrella because it's still something you can talk about within the tech industry, and that's something that a lot of people can relate to. So don't be afraid to just write about career advice within the tech industry as well, not just always strictly technical concepts as well. So those are just some things that you can write about if you're stuck and you're not really sure where to get started. Just draw inspiration from your current life situations. So now let's move on to the actual writing process. So now you found what you wanted to write about. How do you actually get started? So a lot of people will say, I'm just stuck. I don't know where to start, or I keep rewriting things over and over again. My thing is, just start with a draft, knowing it's a rough draft, right? And so probably a lot of you in school remember that you had to write a rough draft and then another draft and then a final draft. And I remember in school, that's how they kind of taught us there. And so just really start with a rough draft. Who cares if like 80% of it is hot garbage? It's totally fine. Like no one has to see it. But I think a lot of people get into their own head and they say, oh, well, maybe I should rewrite this. And they keep editing in their head and then they get blocked and then they stop and then they don't actually end up writing the article. So if you are stuck, just go in and say, all right, I'm just going to word vomit on the page. And there's certain ideas that I'm going to like. And there's probably going to be certain ideas that I'm just going to completely take out. But at least it's a starting point. And I think that's a healthier way to look at it. As long as you can start somewhere, then that's a place where you can edit and grow and get better right there. And so just go into it knowing that the first one is going to be a draft and then it's going to get better and better and better. So once you write your first draft, then read through it, start to edit it, start to write out an outline and say, okay, I really want to cover XYZ points. And here should be the flow for these different points right here. And you're going to probably go through several revisions depending on how large the actual article actually is there. And then also keeping in mind who your audience is. And so if you're writing for beginners, you can't assume anything about their existing knowledge. Or if you are, you should have a prerequisite section and say, hey, this article assumes you have a basic knowledge of HTML and CSS. And so that lets people know, hey, you should have some sort of baseline knowledge because we're not going to go into what is an HTML element in this article. But if you're writing for absolute beginners, then you really do have to cover a lot of things like, hey, this is an HTML element, this is the syntax, this is that. Or if you're having them, if you're doing some sort of tutorial, right, you should say in the prerequisites, this assumes that you've worked with a code editor. Or if that isn't your audience and you want to walk through those steps, or at least give them links to point to how to set up a code editor, what code editor they could use, like VS Code or Sublime or whatever. That way they could get started. Because if you just jump in, especially with like articles on, configurations or working with Git, and if you're just like, oh yeah, you just push up your changes, someone that's brand new to open source and Git has no clue what push up your changes means. And so you can't like make that assumption for an absolute beginner article. You really have to walk through step one, do this, step two, do this, et cetera, et cetera. So always being mindful of who your actual audience is really important there. And then once you kind of get down to a final draft that you really like, then obviously checking for grammar. I mean, most of the time you'll be working in some sort of word processor, so they'll already be highlighting grammar mistakes, but reading it out loud is really important because then sometimes you're going to hear certain sentences. You're like, that sounds weird. Like that's not American English. And I've done that plenty of times where I'm like, what? That's not correct at all. And so sometimes when you're just, scanning through it, you don't always hear it. Like you always catch that. So reading it out loud or having someone else read through it is really important there. And so it's great that you guys have this Slack channel where you guys can share each other's articles with each other and someone else can pick up on something and say, hey, this part was a little bit confusing. Can you expand on that? Or maybe this code example is actually a little bit incorrect. It should be X, Y, and Z. So that's the overall writing process that I use when I am writing technical articles. So let's go on to the next one. All right, so now we've written our article. Where do we actually publish it so the whole world can see it? So I listed just a few options. There's plenty more, but these are a few options. So since I work at FreeCodeCamp, I'm going to promote FreeCodeCamp News. And for FreeCodeCamp News, there's an editorial process. If you have already written before or written technical articles before and you're interested in reaching a larger audience, I'll share the link after this presentation. But basically, it's a short application where you just submit some information about your previous writing experience and then a link to 3 articles you've previously written and had published somewhere. And then they will evaluate that and look through that and then either accept you or not. And then you can reach literally tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. So some of our authors get literally 100, 200, sometimes upwards of 400,000 plus readers a month because they're so prolific in their writing that they've really developed a following. So it's kind of cool. So it's another way that you could get your name out there in this industry and be seen as an expert in your particular field. So other options that are great are Devto. That is a great community and it's free to set up and log in and start writing right away. and then Hashnode or Medium, or you can also just start your own blog. So I think in the past, it was probably a lot of work to start your own blog. But nowadays, like you look at static site generators like Astro, like it's so easy. Like they even have their own tutorial on how to start a blog, and like 40 minutes later, you have a blog site. So there's so many easy ways if you really wanted your own blog. If not, that's really cool. But if you wanted to start your own blog on your own website, there's tons of tutorials and tons of tools that you can use to get up pretty quickly and deploy it somewhere like on Vercel or Netlify or something like that, and hit the ground running if that's an option that you wanted to go down. But there's plenty of free options that you can use to get started, or inexpensive options to get started writing. And so this is not a venture where you have to spend a whole bunch of money or any money, quite frankly. So it's just finding the right environment and situation that works best for you. But those are a few places where you can actually publish your article and start to build a following. So now once you have it published, then you need to actually share it so the world can know like that this thing exists. So sharing on like social media channels like Twitter and LinkedIn, etc. Mastodon, if you're on that, Blue Sky, different Discord channels or Slack groups that you're in. And so once you get in the habit of sharing it with people within your network, then they will also share with people in their network, et cetera, et cetera. And then also complete strangers are going to find your article and start to kind of share it and like it and communicate with you. And so it's really important to just share your work. I know it could be scary, especially if it's your first time writing and you're like, oh my gosh, people are going to judge me, or what if they have, mean things to say and stuff like that. But that's why it's important to have a community like this one, where, if you do have a negative experience, and we'll talk about that in the next slide, how to handle that. But if you do have a negative experience, then you can rely on your community there to kind of help you through that. Because that does unfortunately happen. But there are a lot of positives to sharing your article and just kind of getting your name out there and sharing your expertise, like we talked about earlier. So speaking of feedback, so some feedback you're going to get are going to be just positive comments like, hey, this is a great article, or I learned so much. Some will be constructive, but still helpful. They're not going to be, I wouldn't classify these as mean. These are going to be constructive, well formed feedback where it's clear that they're trying to help. They're not trying to talk down to you. And so if you look at that, like, so let's say you wrote a technical article and there was something in one of your articles where a code example was incorrect, or you're using incorrect terminology, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Or, oh yeah, they would be better to refactor it this way. That could be really helpful, because then you could use that knowledge in future projects. So where it starts to become non-helpful is if somebody is just like, hey, like, oh man, how could you be so stupid, like, to use this concept, or didn't you, oh, I would never write my code this way, this is just moronic. Like, that's obviously not helpful. And it's like, how am I supposed to, that's not actionable feedback. So learning how to like discern between the two of like, this seems actually constructive, and you can tell in the tone if it's meant to be helpful, or if the person is just like trying to troll you. And if it is negative and trolling, and it's clearly not supposed to be actionable feedback, they're just trying to take a dig at you or whatnot, then don't engage with them, because a lot of them are going to want that type of engagement, and then they're going to fire off more insults. And so it's best to just ignore it, because people like that, they're just always trolling people. So it does suck if you get negative feedback. And unfortunately, as women in tech, there are going to be people that are just going to be like, oh, they don't know what they're doing, or they shouldn't be here, blah, 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 blah. And they're going to find any little fault with your article. And so that's why it's really important to be rooted in a community. So if you do have one of those experiences, don't like keep it inside. If it really bothered you, like you open up to your community and be like, hey, I got this really nasty comment on my article, and people can jump in and be like, man, that guy sucks, and like they'll help build you back up right there. So if you do have a situation like that, and you're really affected by it, then reach out to your community and they can help build you back up, which is one of the great things about being involved with healthy constructive communities there, because they can help you through difficult times as well as be there for your happy times. So that's just a little way that you can handle all types of feedback when you start writing articles and people start reading them and responding. All right, so for the last slide here, the best time to start writing is now. Very simple. And so I think we covered like why you should get started and like who can get started. And it's anybody can get started, whether you're literally week one of learning how to code or you're 10 years in or 20 years in. Like, it's a great time to just get started. And your first few articles that you publish and release out into the wild, it might be a little bit scary, but just rely on your community and your network. Be like, yeah, I just released my first one. Feel a little nervous about it. They'll jump in and be like, hey, this is awesome. Congrats on getting your first one off the ground, and they'll be there to support you. So if you are wondering if you should get started, the answer is yes. This is the best time to get started right now. And it's great because you have that challenge already to get started writing articles and publishing it and having the world see it. So yeah, that's it for my presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen if I can find the steer. Oh, there we go. Stop sharing. So if anybody has any questions, or I guess I handed it off to any of the moderators. Yeah.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you for the presentation. We've got a few questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's start with this one. What was your first blog or write-up about?
Yes. So actually, I could grab the link for that, but it was basically just about, I had written it, I think 5 or 6 months into my journey, and it was the reasons why I enjoyed being a beginner. So I can try to find that as well. But that was my first article. So it wasn't even like a strictly technical article on like SQL or anything like that. It was just, this is what I like about learning. And that was the very first one that I wrote about there on FreeCodeCamp.
Thank you. Kind of related. So if we don't have any previous technical blogging experience, would you be still be able to publish to FreeCodeCamp?
Yeah, so in that situation, then I would actually start with Devto and just write 3 articles that you're interested in. So as part of this challenge, you could, because the great thing about Devto is like you could just self-publish. There's no, editorial team that's you have to submit it to. And so if you have 3 articles that you want to write about, then you can self-publish it and create a free account on Dev2 and then release it on there. And then you could just copy those links and then fill out the application there.
Okay, so for the FreeCodeCamp, you have to go through an editorial process, right?
Yeah. So the process, you can write about anything that you want at any frequency. So it's not like they're going to require you to write like once a week or twice a week or anything like that. You can literally write once a year if you really want to, or every 5 years if you really want to. But once you have an idea that you want to write about, you can sit down and write the article and then copy and paste the draft. So we are right now using Ghost as our platform. And you can copy the draft link and then send it to Abby, who's the head of our editorial team. And so you send it, and then she reads through it, and she'll leave comments. And if everything looks good, then she'll immediately just publish it. Or if there needs to be some sort of changes, then she'll email you back and be like, "Hey, if you could change this, this, or this." But there's a pretty quick turnaround, so it's not like you're waiting weeks and weeks and weeks. Like, I was kind of surprised how quickly things were turned around, because I remember I submitted my first article and then like 6 hours later it was published. I'm like, oh, okay. Thanks. And so a lot of times she's very quick about reading through the different articles and then giving feedback, and or if everything's great, then she will go ahead and just publish it. And so you can get an article published within a matter of like a day or so.
Wow, that's really fast. Okay. What kind of code text editor do you use like before publishing it on FreeCodeCamp or Medium and other stuff?
Yeah. So I actually like working within VS Code, and I have a few Markdown plugins that I use. And so I like to use there's like a Markdown. I can find the exact one, but there's a really helpful Markdown plugin where it will format some of your code for you, will highlight a lot of syntax and give you that experience as if you're just reading through the final preview there. And so I really like working with those tools just right in my code editor. I know that like Google Docs also supports Markdown. I think you just have to configure a few things within the Google Docs settings. So that's another option that you could write. But I like writing within VS Code and then just creating a .md file, a Markdown file, and just kind of writing from there.
Wow, I wouldn't have thought about writing in the code editor actually. So who was the editor of FreeCodeCamp? It was Abby, right? And how do we connect with her?
Yeah. So it's going to be editorial at freecodecamp.org. And there's a few other people part of the editorial team, but she's like the head of the team there. And so if you message her there, she's pretty good about getting back with messages. And so especially once you're an author there, then she's pretty good about responding back within a few days. The only time that it takes longer is if the team is on some sort of break, holiday break like Christmas or something like that, or she's off for like a personal break. But she's really good about setting up automated replies saying, "Hey, I'm out of the office and I'll be back here." So working with her has been great for the past few years there.
Yeah, thank you. Also another question. What are the key elements of a successful tech blog for a front-end developer?
Yeah. So I think for front end specifically, I think there's a few things. Number one, I think really having in-depth articles on some of the newer technologies is helpful because sometimes, like, if we look at stuff like Quick or Svelte, they're starting to have some more writing about that. But the running joke is that there's always a new front end technology out there and coming out pretty much every single day. But some of the newer ones, especially like a good example of this would be Astro, and Astro's been out for a while, but they also just have released their Starlight, which is their documentation site. So it's similar to like Docusaurus, if you're familiar with that. And but there's not too many articles about Starlight that I could find there, and so sometimes you'll have new features that people just aren't writing about. So maybe within like Angular, or React, or Vue, or even Quick or Svelte, or any of these tools, some of these newer features that are coming out, there's actually not a lot of articles. So that's another way that you can kind of focus on there. But some of the key elements there is it should be really easy to understand. Like people shouldn't have to come to the table with like constantly pausing and saying like, what do they mean here? Or this is really complicated, or let me open up MDN to try to decipher what this person's trying to say. Like they should be able to read top to bottom, and you should be able to give them all of the context. So the flow just works really nicely there. And so if it's easy to read and they're able to learn something new, and another way is if like you're able to break down complex, front end concepts in nice, easy to understand ways, that's always helpful. So I've seen authors that have used different analogies to explain things like async and await and JavaScript and stuff like that. And the way they are able to explain these concepts, it's super, super easy and friendly where you're like, oh yeah, I never really thought of it that way. And they use examples with like food or animals and stuff to explain some of these concepts. And the way they're able to explain it, it just makes it so approachable. So they take a big, scary topic and then they're able to break it down and explain it to somebody that's like, like the saying, like, explain it like I'm five type situation. So articles that are able to be straightforward, where people will understand what you're talking about, and you can really help break down some misconceptions that they might have, or break down really complex front end topics, is always a great key element right there.
Thank you. That was such a great and detailed answer. So how can a beginner balance technical depth with readability in their blog posts?
Okay. Yeah, I think that so explaining tech, you said technical depth in terms of just a project that they're working on.
Yeah, I think so.
So if you're wanting to explain technical debt, um, for a project that you're working on, if I'm understanding the question correctly, then definitely link to that particular project that you're working on, but then also to just breaking it down as best as possible, like what the actual issue is, and then breaking it down into smaller steps. So I might be misunderstanding your question right there, but that would be my approach there.
I think it means like how, like if someone doesn't understand what a code editor is, then it's like, how do you know kind of where to
Oh,
start
okay.
really?
Got it. Okay, so like if you're writing an article on, let's say, you're writing a tutorial article on how to build a I don't know, a background color changer, and you want them to build it out locally. And so one way that you could do this, so one of the cool things actually with Dev2 is you could build a series. It makes it really easy where you can link several articles together. So you could have like a part 1 on how to set up VS Code and say, okay, we're going to build this background color changer, but we're going to actually start off with learning how to use VS Code. And so now you're making the assumption that they are an absolute beginner, that they've never used a code editor, and you're going to walk them through with part 1 before they actually start building out the project and say, okay, here's how you install VS Code for both Mac and Windows. And then here are some of the extensions that you can have on VS Code. Here's some of the core features that we're going to need. And so you can have just one article by itself, just as like a setup article. And then part 2 could be about, okay, great, now let's start a CSS file and, do this. And then part 3 could be, or part 2 could be like HTML, and then part 3 could be CSS or something like that. So that's one way that you can approach it. Another way is that you can have a section within the article and say, hey, if you're new to working with code editors, here are some great articles and videos where you can set up the project. And so you can have that at the very beginning there as like a prerequisite and say like, oh, okay, this assumes that you have a familiarity. If not, then I would suggest checking out these articles or checking out these videos on how to get started with VS Code or whatever code editor of choice there, CodePen or Code Sandbox or whatever, and how you can get started with that and get that set up. And then when you're ready, you can jump into part 1 of this project. So those are a couple of ways that you can kind of handle that given situation.
Oh, thank you. What are some common mistakes beginners make in tech blogging, and how can they avoid them?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is skipping steps. So I see this a lot with like particularly how to get started with open source or how to create your first pull request. So if they're writing an article about here's how to get started with a pull request, they'll say things like, okay, great. So just kind of fork it and then make some changes and push it up. And then here's a pull request. But they skipped like a whole bunch of steps because somebody that's brand new to Git has no clue what forking it. They don't know that they have to clone it. They don't, you have to set up your environment with Git and all this other stuff. And so if you're writing an absolute beginner article on how to get started with your first pull request, you do have to address all of those extra steps and say, okay, here's how you fork a repo. And then you walk through that. You maybe give them a link to the GitHub docs and how to do that. And then you can say, okay, here's how to clone it. This is what cloning a site means. Here's how you do this. Here's how you do that. This is what a terminal is. This is where you can find the terminal. So you do have to give all those levels of details because you can't assume like if your target audience is absolute beginners, they've never contributed to open source, they've never worked with Git before, then you can't assume that they might not know where the terminal is. And so they might not know they've written any type of Git commands. And so you can't just say like, oh yeah, just kind of use like push, Git push and you'll be all good to go. They're going to have no clue what any of that means. And so you have to walk through step by step. So that's probably one of the biggest mistakes is just skipping steps and making assumptions, particularly for beginner articles. And then some of the other ones that are more obvious is like not quoting sources accurately. And so if you are going to quote something from like MDN docs or something like that, then obviously you have to properly quote it. You can't like pass it off as your own. But there's so many easy ways that you can quote resources. And then the other thing is just double checking your code resources. And so you don't want to just write up some code and then not test it, right? And so you want to make sure that you can reproduce that application and have it running the way it is. Or if you're talking about like how to use, deploy an application to Netlify, maybe that's one of your articles, then you should walk through all of those steps and make sure that you haven't skipped anything, because the last thing you want to have happen is someone reads your article and then you skip the step and they're like, wait a minute, I can't see my application on Netlify, and it turns out you missed a step. So you always want to reproduce that and make sure that you can actually follow your own steps to make sure that's working. So those are some of the common mistakes there that I see for beginner tech writers there.
Yeah, it makes sense to go step by step. We've got some other questions. So, what are your thoughts and preferences on certain platforms to avoid, like Dev2, Substack, Medium? There's like just so many. What do you prefer, and where do you recommend people to start off with?
Yeah, I've had a lot of good experiences with Dev2. I think generally that's a good platform, and they've actually been pretty good about moderation from the time that I've been on there. So there were a couple of times where if people there was like one situation where somebody was literally just copied my article and republished it on Devto, and I reported it, and they removed it immediately, so it wasn't this long back and forth. It happened very quickly, and so I think they're pretty good about their moderation. And if you feel like a comment is derogatory or whatnot, you can report it, and they're pretty on top of that. So I would say in general that's a pretty safe space. And then with FreeCodeCamp News, there's no like reply buttons or sections on the actual articles right there, so you don't really have to worry about that situation. And the overall FreeCodeCamp community is pretty healthy. But those are some of the platforms that I've had positive experiences. I know a lot of my friends are on Hashnode, and they've had good things to say. And so sometimes it's okay to just try out a platform and see how the team responds to certain situations. And if they respond poorly, or if they try to like gaslight you or something and be like, oh, that didn't happen, then it's like, leave that platform immediately, because like it's really their job as moderators to create a healthy, inclusive community. And if they're literally not doing anything about it, then just leave, because there's so many other platforms that you could choose from.
Yeah, that makes sense. We only have time for 2 more questions. So the first one is, do you recommend leaving troll comments up or removing them? This is probably for your own blog.
Yeah, so for your blog there, you can structure it like one of two ways. So you could have a blog that doesn't have the ability for people to leave comments. You could structure it in a way where you could have like a heart button on there. And so if you don't want people to comment on it, and you could technically build the blog without that feature, that's not technically required. But if you wanted to have an ability to add comments to your personal blog, or if you're working on something like Dev2 where people can leave comments, then if something is really cross the line and is derogatory, then I would flag it and report it and have it removed right there, because they do have strict code of conduct. And so you should feel comfortable to remove it if they've clearly crossed the line and have stepped their boundaries and are trying to be derogatory or mean-spirited towards you. Then it's totally fine to just block it, report it, and have that removed immediately.
Yeah, thank you. Last question. Is it a good practice to link someone else's article for reference for requisites?
Yeah, I think that's totally fine to link them, and you could say, hey, check out so and so's article about, I don't know, recursion or whatever, or setting up Astro, or and I think that's great to kind of link to them within your given article right there. But so as long as you give them like the proper credit due there, so as long as you're not trying to pass it off as like your article or something, be like, oh, I wrote this, even though like clearly someone else did. But I think it's totally fine to like within the article link other people's articles, and sometimes that might be necessary because it's something that might be necessary there too, where you're like, oh, so to learn more about XYZ topics, you can read about these articles from so and so authors, and you can have that at like the footer of your article there.
Great, thank you. We'll be wrapping up the session then.
So Jessica, I actually have a few more questions for you if you don't mind answering those.
Sure, yeah.
One of the questions that I wanted to ask was, how would you use technical writing skills to elevate our job hunting process in today's market?
Yeah, that's a great question, because as I mentioned, today's market's a little bonkers. We're still kind of dealing with the effects of 2023 and the end of 2022, unfortunately. So here's how I would approach it there. So I would start to research the type of jobs I'm interested in. So obviously this is a front end space, and so I would research the type of jobs in my local market, or even if I'm interested in like remote jobs, and kind of get a sense of like what they're looking for, what types of there's always going to be some sort of similarities in the job descriptions, and then I would actually start writing articles about that. And so if they're looking for a React expert, for example, then I would start writing some more React articles to show people like, hey, I know what I'm doing. Like, I've built React applications, I have work experience, I have XYZ years of work experience, or I've built XYZ projects using React. I know what I'm doing. You want to be able to communicate how you're qualified for that particular job. And so I would strategically start writing specific articles for the jobs that I'm interested in, And so you could do the same thing for like any technology. I just picked on React there, but you could, if you want to showcase that you are knowledgeable in that area and you could do the job and help stand out from this competitive market, then start writing some articles, sharing that. And this is going to be a longer process. Like, it's not going to be like, oh, I wrote one article and then immediately got a job from it. But if you're continually writing articles and you want to communicate that you are, you have expertise and you're an expert in that area, and that you can add a lot of value to a company, then hiring managers and recruiters can start to see that. Especially in that case, I would definitely participate more on LinkedIn, because that's where a lot of recruiters and hiring managers hang out anyway. And then I would also, if you're interested, like actively applying for jobs and you already have a few of these articles, especially if you have like Google Analytics of how many people are reading these articles, you could reach out to recruiters and hiring managers for positions that you're interested in and say, hey, I have demonstrated experience in XYZ areas. And I've also written several articles about that have readership of 100,000 people a month or whatever, and you can pull that data to show like, hey, I know what I'm doing. And so I'm not just like some sort of hack that doesn't know what they're going to do in this company. Like, I know what I'm doing. I know how to work with your tech stack. I'd be a great addition to your team. So that's a great way to kind of communicate to people that you are qualified and kind of stand out from that sea of resumes there.
That was amazing. I'm definitely going to apply that for sure. My next question would be, when it comes to both learning and practicing technical writing, which I assume is not that similar to like regular writing or blogging, do you have any resources that you would recommend to people on learning or improving their technical writing skills aside from actually trying to apply in their blog?
Yeah, yes, I think there's a lot of great articles on. I don't know how many of you are familiar with OpenSa. It's a startup that helps promote getting started with open source projects there, and so they have a whole bunch of articles on their Devto. So I'll type it in the chat there. The name is OpenSa. Oops, let me see if I can spell open source correctly. So if you go to their Devto profile, they have tons of articles specifically about writing as well. And so written by Becca, who's a good friend of mine who works at OpenSa. And so she has a lot of great articles specifically about writing. And yeah, OpenSauce.pizza. Yeah, that's their that's their whole thing. But yeah, so she has a lot of great articles and tips about more practical sides of technical writing there. And so I would definitely check out her articles because she mainly leads the writing portion of that for that company there. So she has some great ideas about how to get started and how to kind of format your technical writing.
Awesome. And lastly, I have one last question, which is, what kind of lesser technical content would you think is okay for us to write about, even if it's still relating to tech, but it's, for example, not having to explain a technical concept? I hope that's understandable.
Yeah. So if I understand correctly, like kind of less, not as much technical, like how to approach like less technical articles. Is that your question there, or?
Yeah, so like for example, subjects about being laid off or having to navigate the job hunting process and things of that sort, or even just
Gotcha.
anything relating to being on someone's tech journey, but they're not necessarily having to explain step by step what they're doing in their project or something of the sort. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think those types of articles are great too, because there's so many people that can identify with your story. And I actually just saw this a few weeks ago, where someone was talking about her start. She took a really long road, or not a long road, but it took a while in this challenging market to get her first job. And so she actually wrote about it, and tens of thousands of people shared that article because it was so relatable, and so people, and it was so inspiring of a story, because they think thousands of people are going through this similar thing, but she was actually able to talk about it and talk about how she doubted herself and was about to leave the industry altogether. And she kept, going through the job process, rejection after rejection, and then ended up getting a great software engineer job in this crazy market that we're in. And so she wrote an article about that. It just was very honest about that, and thousands of people read it, reshared it on Twitter. And so those types of articles are great too, because it shows a different side to you. It shows that you never know who's going to be able to reach out to you. So if you're going through a layoff, you're going through a setback, maybe you're pipped or something like that at your job, and you want to write about it, I think that's totally great as well. It shows like a different side, and you just never know who's going to reach out after that.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Great.
thank you.
We are currently at time, so we're going to keep it pushing from here after a Q&A session. Here's a reminder to join our writing club kickoff. So in our Slack channel, make sure that the channel that you're browsing to look for is #tech/writing/club, not blogging. Sorry about that. If you still need any help joining that, please DM us on Slack and let us know. And from here, thank you so much for being with all of us today. We're so happy and excited to have heard from you guys and to get to talk about tech writing and learn more about Jessica's experience and to hear more from her expertise, which is incredibly valuable and insightful. And from here, again, thank you so much. If you have any more questions, don't forget to ask them on Slack. We will definitely attend to your questions as well. And I'll hand it over to Tomi as we move forward.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Jessica. I learned a lot from this meeting. Just as Lisa said, if anyone has any other questions, you could just, if you have any other question, just reach out to Jessica on LinkedIn. I'm sure she'll be available to respond. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.